All right. Hi, everybody. It's our CFB Talk 141. It's Tuesday night. I'm your host, Bob Akayeri. It's always a good time to talk college football, but Tuesday nights are when we like to talk to you. So I'm going to go ahead and fire this up. Just going to go ahead and send a quick instruction. Always want to hear from you. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, you can always hit request on the Twitter app. Should work for you, and I will be happy to let you up and hear about what you're thinking as we head into the week. It's funny, each week that proceeds after the lull that comes right after the national championship, which kind of bottoms out in February, things start to pick up and the news starts to build. So there's so much going on. If you have a thought you want to add, feel free to chime in. You know, one of the things I'm just going to kind of dive right into, a lot of kind of discussion has been going on the NIL front because, as I have mentioned before, and if you've been paying attention to what's been going on, all the states in the offseason have been coming up with their own ways to sort of revise their NIL rules. And that's kind of created an interesting situation with multiple states with different rules in them. And one of those pushes that's been coming, and again, I'm not saying this is what we support, is a federal regulation. And apparently there's various groups in Congress that are trying to get this done. One of the ones that kind of struck me that popped up actually this past week was reporting by Dennis Dodd, is a subcommittee. They're trying to create a federal regulatory body to oversee NIL rights for college football and college sports in general. I guess they even have a name for it. It sounds really fancy. The United States Intercollegiate Athletics Commission, the USIAC. So their idea is they want to create something that would permit a way to allow NIL deals, give the NCAA some legal protection, and I guess categorically say athletes can't be employees. Now, I'm not sure if frankly, I think we're going in that direction, but we'll see. And again, it's one of these attempts to create a potential regulatory body on a national level. And that, again, as I said, that's not the only one. There's apparently that one I just mentioned was coming from some congressmen from Florida. And then meanwhile, some Ohio congressmen are trying to create something called the Student Athlete Level Playing Field Act to create federal standards for NIL and clarifying that athletes aren't employees. That, again, seems to be a kind of common theme. It's not entirely shocking to see this only because Charlie Baker, the new NCAA president, has been trying to push some federal regulation on this. One of the things, and to kind of put this in a larger context, we talked about this. Oklahoma was the state that first came up with this legislative idea that was a popular NIL bill that got sidetracked. We'll get to that in a second. But they passed a bill, or at least they created a bill, that would not allow NCAA investigations in the state of Oklahoma on any NIL deals. So in a way, creating a level of protection around Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Tulsa, of course. Now, it kind of got sidetracked because in a totally, and I mean, this had nothing to do with this particular bill, but the governor of the state vetoed every single bill on his desk, saying he wasn't going to pass anything without some of his, again, I'm not going to get into the state politics of Oklahoma, but it was basically, he was saying, I'm not going to pass anything until you give me this particular law on my desk. Well, apparently this past week, the Oklahoma legislature finally got around to overriding that veto, 120-13, because college sports are very bipartisan. And now Oklahoma has a law that will allow college players to have agents for NIL deals and block NCAA investigations into NIL deals. Of course, while all of this was going on in Oklahoma, Missouri topped everyone with their own law a few weeks ago. Mizzou is now basically the main beneficiary of this, unless Truman State decides it wants to become an FBS power. So if you are a high school student in Mizzou and you sign an NIL deal with a university in the state, or pardon me, if you sign, if you say you're going to go, if you sign that letter of intent, you're, as a high school player in the state of Missouri, allowed to have an NIL deal, and their own law says the state cannot investigate you. So again, this kind of weird, like each state is coming up with their own rules, has started to create, unsurprisingly, a bit of tension. And within the granddaddy of all the conferences right now in terms of money, the SEC. Because you have states that are now looking at each other and teams that are looking at each other and saying, well, okay, Florida won't allow this as a state, but Missouri will. Oklahoma, which is, of course, joining the SEC, can get away with some things. And Texas, I believe, is also passing laws that are similar to that. So that's where some of this push and pull is coming from when you're hearing discussions about, oh, is there going to be federal legislation or will it just stay in the state? It's a lot of fan bases are looking at what's going on in neighboring states, and it's kind of part of what makes this such an interesting time. There was another, and again, if you'd like to join this conversation or anything about college football, we're not just stuck talking about NAL. I just wanted to kind of discuss this stuff at the beginning of this particular half hour, only because it's been kind of an interesting set of developments this week. But again, if you'd like to join the conversation, hit request on the Twitter app, and I'd be happy to let you up and hear what you're thinking. But going back to, again, one of the I wouldn't say an extreme position, but Joel Klatt, obviously college football personality, he thinks the parameters surrounding the NIL have gone way too far towards the players and thinks that perhaps they're getting handed too much money and this isn't something that they're quite ready for. I know that isn't necessarily the most popular view, especially on our CFB. Got a lot of a pushback on that. But as we get into this 2-year mark of NIL, he thinks that they need to revise it, and especially the pendulum, he feels, has swung too far and it needs to come back a little bit. I'm not sure if the genie can be put back into the bottle there. I think one of the things, and I'm going to go actually to someone on our CFB, because the comment sections are pretty good. One of the better comments on that particular topic was actually a Texas A&M fan, Lib Southerner. I think NIL is fine on its own. I think the transfer portal is fine on its own, but together, it's like a completely unabated free agency for every single player every single year, which isn't good for any sport. If players are going to get paid, which I support, they need to be recognized as full employees. So I guess he wants to go the full employees route. I'm not sure that's going to work out, but certainly that's one of those options that's been out there. Speaking on that same topic, actually today there was actually a good article put out on The Athletic via David Ubben, friend of the program. And Nick Saban was asked about this, and he says, I have no problem having players be employees, but he gave an ominous warning. He's like, if you think there's disparity in college football now, there's going to be a lot more in the future. And that is something where in these circumstances, we've seen Coach Saban basically give those kinds of warnings. He said that before when NIL was coming up. It's like, if you want to go down this path, he knows he's at Alabama and he's Nick Saban. He can get the money. He can compete at the top level. But it's more or less a warning to every school but like 4 or 5 that if you're willing to do this, can you get into that kind of competition? I mean, we know that there is Tennessee freshman QB signed a deal with Spire Sports, which is associated with University of Tennessee. That's going to pay him apparently $8 million over 4 years. We all, or most of you, have probably heard of the old Jalen Rashada saga, which would have supposedly paid him $13 million to go to Florida over 4 years, but it fell apart. Now he's at Arizona State. Still probably getting a good amount of money, but not necessarily that kind of money. So again, we're seeing a lot of this kind of heading out there. At one point, I believe he even made a comment that, you're seeing Southern Cal, Texas, and Oklahoma doing their thing. And it seemed like Nick Saban was basically using the bat signal to tell his own boosters that, hey, keep sending money. We need this to win. And again, knowing Nick Saban, I'm not even going to – he really does think that everything he does is about recruiting, and he knows that is the absolute way to building a program and a beast of a program like he has and like one of his disciples, Kirby Smart, has done in Georgia right now. On a lighter note, before I kind of wrap up this NIL collective talk, Harvard boosters, and this is actually from a little over a week ago, but it looks like Harvard boosters are starting an NIL collective. The athletics department sent an email to supporters explaining it doesn't sanction or support the group soliciting donations to start the collective. But if there is a university or one of those universities that has the ability to just decide to become a college football player, it is the Ivy League teams, particularly Harvard and Yale. I mean, their endowments are in the tens of billions of dollars. Their alumni are worth in the tens of billions of dollars. If they really wanted to compete at these levels, they certainly could. And plus, they have a little department called admissions, which can make or break a lot of people's careers. If football doesn't work out for you, imagine getting an a great NIL deal at Harvard, and also graduating with a Harvard degree or a Yale degree. And maybe one day Stanford will learn how to twist that into their own favor. On that note, again, just a quick reminder, this is our CFB Talk 141. I'm Bob Kyrie. This is really Tuesday nights. We'd like to hear from you. So if you'd like to, hit request and join the conversation about whatever topic you'd like in college football, we'd love to have you up here, and I'll be happy to hear from you and let you up. Kind of moving on to another topic that's been kind of interesting this week is there's been rumblings out of Colorado. Dennis Dodd had an article today with a couple of tweets that were associated with it, that Colorado has held substantive talks with the Big 12 as the Buffaloes consider leaving the Pac-12. I don't think any of that is entirely shocking. I think in this, as I've jokingly said, this grand knife fight that is potentially going to break out between the Pac-12 and the Big 12 for the scraps of what remained after both conferences lost their two marquee teams to the Big Ten and SEC respectively. One of those things is who's going to come out ahead. And you have, Kliavkoff, who's more of a quiet commissioner at the Pac-12. You have Yormark, who's more brash and interesting. I mean, he keeps trying to be dynamic and announce interesting, ideas that they're going to be doing at the Big 12. So where are these teams going to lie? And obviously the big push has been whether or not the Big 12 can perhaps lure the Four Corners schools, the two Arizona schools, plus Utah, plus Colorado, or is there going to be a rush between those two conferences to try and get San Diego State, who seems to be the one the Pac-12 would like to add to get back to 12 teams, and perhaps adding SMU along with that to bring the Metroplex into the Pac-12. It's kind of an interesting situation, but what this article kind of brought out is what people have assumed is that there has been conversations sort of behind the scenes between the Colorado and the Big 12 just to sort of see if there is something going on. And they actually had a heck of a quote in there. The athletic director, Rick George of Colorado, said, "I have no comment other than what I said last week," which, okay, that doesn't sound great, but we are proud members of the Pac-12, which always sounds ominous. In a perfect world, we'd love to be in the Pac-12, but we also have to do what is right for Colorado at the end of the day, which is brutally honest. I think that's ultimately what a lot of conference teams are thinking. I think USC would have loved to have stayed, and UCLA would have loved to have stayed in the Pac-12, but in the end, they did what they felt was right for their programs. USC just wanted more money, and UCLA desperately needed more money because of the way their athletic department was in a bit of debt. So ultimately, that's what it's going to come down to. And of course, we know that the media rights deal that right now the Big 12 is offering appears to be $31.7 million beginning in 2025. So right now, and I think the delay on finding out what the Pac-12 media deal is going to be is they are desperately trying to make sure they can come either extremely close or well beyond that number to maintain those programs that are left that have a certain level of desirability outside of the conference. Obviously, you have Oregon, you have Washington, and then you have Colorado, Utah, and the Arizona schools. And I'm not trying to say Cal, Stanford, Wazoo, and Oregon State aren't worth anything. But I mean, it's going to be an interesting point there. Even Deion Sanders, who of course is a lightning rod in of his own self, has said he thinks none of it would be happening. They said none of it would be happening if Deion wasn't willing to sign off on it. Dennis Dodd said he was told that Deion Sanders wants to get Colorado back into Texas, which some people joked sounded like he was planning to relocate the campus. But again, as most of you probably know, since you're listening to College Football Talk in the offseason, Colorado, that was where they were from. They were from the Big 12, and this would be their opportunity to perhaps go back home. To not say that there isn't a desire in the Pac-12 for them to stay there. But again, this is one of those things where there seems to be a push and a pull within that program on whether they stay in the Pac-12 or if there's a reason for them to go back to the Big 12. Speaking of which, This was a post that came up on RCFB actually within the last hour, and it is related to this. The University of Oregon AD, Rob Mullins, had an interview where he was confident that the Pac-12 will beat that aforementioned $31 million, I think $31.6, $31.7 million per year, that the Big 12 is going to be paying out in media to its own team starting in 2025. His concerns were only over the future home and home of P5 out of conference scheduling under the new playoff format, and said, and this was interesting, the Pac-12 could look at a 10-game conference schedule. Now, we've talked about one of the big topics this week as the SEC is having its own meetings is whether or not that conference is going to move from an 8-team conference schedule to a 9-team conference schedule. 9-team is what most of the other conferences are doing, particularly the Pac-12. The Pac-12 started doing a 9-team conference schedule when it was still the Pac-10. So it was actually doing round robin for several years there to try and keep itself at a higher level of competition when it was trying to, again, vie for BCS ranking. Now, heading into, the Pac-12, they still stuck with a 9-game conference season. So teams weren't necessarily playing everybody every year because they were able to switch to divisions. But now, apparently, with the risk to out-of-conference scheduling and the new expanded playoff, the Pac-12 is considering, according to the athletic director of the University of Oregon, moving to a 10-game conference schedule. He said in his own right that he prefers 9 conference games with one high-profile out-of-conference opponent, which is usually a P5 opponent, one G5, and one FCS program. But noted that finding a high-profile opponent is becoming, quote, increasingly difficult. He noted that the Texas A&M had canceled a series with Oregon, again, as they were joining the SEC, and that forced them to scramble and pay, $1.6 million to get San Jose State to show up and change their schedule to make a trip to Eugene. So again, this seems to be something interesting. And when the Pac-12 sort of conference mentioning here, it is interesting to hear, again, another athletic director there seeming confident. And supposedly they're privy to the conversations over these media rights deals that the Pac-12 will either equal or beat the Big 12's media deal at this point and stay together. And really, it sounds like in this case, they're just trying to move on and figure out what the future is going to be in terms of conference scheduling, especially if that is something that they are not able to maintain the level of out-of-conference scheduling that they had planned. Moving over to, again, what we were just talking about there on the SEC, one of the big things there has been whether or not they're going to expand from an 8-team conference schedule to a 9-team conference schedule, or I should say 9-game conference schedule. Moving to 16 teams, there's been a lot of discussion of how that's going to work out. They're going to have guaranteed games every year. I believe each team is going to be having several guaranteed opponents. Their major rivals, as well as some connected regional teams. They're going to go, obviously, break away from division. So now the question is, how do you spread the love more, and how do you make sure teams get an opportunity to play and have a high level of play? With what's going on, I know from what the discussions that are coming out of the SEC in terms of what the presidents are wanting and the athletic directors and the coaches, there seems to be a little bit of a separation here. You have a school like Georgia. It seems like Alabama and some of the other stronger teams are in favor of potentially adding an extra conference game, while some of the other teams that tend to be right on that border of bowl eligibility and at the cusp of trying to break out, like a Kentucky, they seem to be in favor of keeping the 8 conference games and then allowing to throw in some, I don't want to say chaff, but throw in, some more games against G5 opponents or even FCS opponents. And there's a question of, and here comes the push and pull and all of that. You have some, coaches like, LSU's, oh my gosh, my own brain is totally fried on me now. That are, he says, if we're going to have if we're going to have, compete for TV rights, we should be putting out a higher end. Brian Kelly said, TV demands great matchups. you've got to put in front of your fan base quality competition. I think if the TV rights deals keep increasing, I don't know. I'd be curious to know the numbers, and I'd love to see the economists who work for these conferences crack those numbers to see how much value there is for these home games that against an FCS opponent or against a G5 opponent versus what they could be getting in TV money if they schedule more marquee games and make every week a must-see TV for college football fans on a national level, not just the hardcore fans are going to watch your team play, I'm not going to single out any FCS program, but just a FCS program versus those that would like to see a game between either your marquee program and a P5 or even a strong G5 program. That certainly would be better for TV. And if TV is really what's driving a lot of these deals and a lot of these movements within college football, I think it's hard not to see that. Again, taking a quick second for station ID. This is our CFB Talk 141. I'm Bob Ekhayeri, your host. If anyone wants to join the conversation, please hit request. It doesn't have to be any of the topics we've just touched on. Whatever you find interesting in college football, we'd love to hear you talk about it. Love to hear your thoughts on it. So hit request on the Twitter app, and I'd be happy to let you up here. But in the meantime, kind of again, tying in both the SEC as well as conference expansion talk, SEC's Greg Sankey was asked again this week, actually today, because again, they're having their meetings right now. Brett McMurphy tweeted that he was asked about expanding beyond 16 schools. And he commented, this is not on the forefront at all. It isn't even an active thought process for the SEC. Quote, we are highly attentive of what's going around the country, in which case they are looking at what's going on right now. But the idea of adding the SEC, it just doesn't make any sense. Again, going to some of the comments by some of the folks on RCFB, one of the better comments was by, I think, LSU fan, then Cricket2312, and I will read the username because why not? I want to credit the guy. The SEC would probably be happiest if nothing else happens right now. And this is the part I like. I think they'd rather the ACC stay alive, which keeps the Big Ten out of the South. And I kind of like that thought because while FSU and Clemson certainly have voiced, and we've talked about it before, an interest in leaving the ACC, of course, the problem is the ACC had some top-notch lawyers design the grant of rights deal, which is locking them all into a conference media arrangement with a brutal buyout that I believe Florida State had calculated in February was going to be like $120 million to leave. But it sounds like FSU has always liked the idea of joining the SEC. Apparently, they flirted with it decades ago, but were not accepted in favor, I believe, of expansion that went to South Carolina at the time. And Clemson would also very much like to, because they certainly have some ties with SEC programs historically, not just South Carolina, but also obviously Georgia and some of the others. So those two would love to move, but the problem is what would happen to all the other teams, and they're not all junk, obviously. So you get a team like the question is, would Virginia or North Carolina or Virginia Tech or Miami or Georgia Tech, because it's in Atlanta and you're suddenly in the heart of Georgia, would any of those suddenly become desirable additions for the Big Ten? Because suddenly, if the money is being determined by TV viewers, and suddenly the Big Ten can get some teams in that region, suddenly you've got some competition. And that's why I thought that comment about the SEC having somewhat of a selfish interest in the survival of the ACC seemed to be a good observation. And I appreciated reading that one, because if the ACC breaks apart, while the Big Ten has been very lukewarm to the idea of adding teams when it was looking west, as much as Oregon and Washington desperately want to get out of the Pac-12 and join something like the Big Ten, it wasn't entirely clear if that interest was mutual. Certainly, if the ACC broke apart, the money would be hard to ignore if suddenly the Atlanta market or Florida popped into the equation for potentially adding a team. So again, the SEC, though, happy to stay at 16 per their commissioner, and I don't have any reason to doubt that. I was mentioning this bat signal comment that Nick Saban threw up. But Brett McMurphy, again, another good tweet from him from today. Nick Saban said, quote, "You think there's parity here? I think the way Southern Cal, Texas, and Texas A&M are spending money, it hasn't hit yet. It's going to be what are you willing to spend?" So again, they're talking about whether or not it's like the NFL or if it's really not like the NFL. And Nebraska fan, Perpiacious Crumb. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what's called a bat signal or a booster whistle or something to get some of those Alabama boosters ready to start competing into that higher level of finances. And maybe that's part of it. And there was an interesting kind of editorial published in the Athletic recently where someone was deriding where all of this is going and saying, like, if we're going to turn into the NFL, that would be something where you have salary caps. But right now, this is just seeming to be turning into a freewheeling world of unlimited money, and some very curious decisions that are being made. Ross Dellinger over at SI actually had another kind of article on the same topic that came out recently. In a trend sweeping through the SEC, schools are exploring ways to operate name, image, likeness, NIL from their foundations. Now, that technically violates NCAA rules and risks Title IX infractions and straddles the employment line. But at the same time, they're all just trying to compete with each other with these weird rules that kind of differ now state by state. As I was talking at the beginning of the show, what's going on in Oklahoma, what's going on in Mizzou, what's going on in Texas. Each of those state legislatures have passed looser rules and what were recently passed in even Florida, which had technically just loosened its own rules, and in Alabama. So you're getting these weird zones where SEC teams are looking at how other SEC teams can compete, and they're having to make quick bandages in order to solve it, because I'm sure they could get their states to pass another rule law again, but that takes time. So what they need to do is they need to win now. So again, you've got these interesting competitions going on all around there. So that was an interesting, I think, article by Dellinger, and I recommend it if you get a chance. Kind of moving along. Poor poor Coach Drinkwitz at Mizzou. He got a quote taken out of context, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about what he actually said here. So, there was a claim that he was complaining about player compensation, and I see we have someone who wants to come up, so I'm going to let you up in a second. Triple option. He said, I'm no way complaining about player compensation. I'm pro NIL. And then he pointed to he was talking about the state law that I talked about that allows, it's probably one of the loosest NIL rules out there right now. It allows for high school players who have signed letters of intent to can receive NIL deals in the state of Missouri as long as they're going to a Missouri school. So again, that benefits Mizzou. He's just asking for guardrails. And that was something that he wanted to emphasize. He said, this is, again, the question was, a reporter asked Coach Drink, when you see issues with gambling, because that was obviously a big thing, which kind of blew up at the two Iowa schools in the past month. When you see issues with gambling arising, what's your approach with your team about that issue? And is there an element of surprise, or is it inevitable? Coach Drink, this is sort of his reply. You all are really trying to get me in trouble here, with a bit of probably a laughing sigh. this is again Coach Drink speaking. Deion Sanders had a really good quote the other day talking about young men are joining a business, but we want to treat them like kids. We're giving guys 18, 19, 22-year-olds, probably 22-year-olds, life-changing money. People are making more money in NIL than my brother-in-law, who is a pediatrician, who saves lives, and we are doing it in a cavalier, and we think that there's not going to be any side effect. There's not going to be any issues. There's information out there. There's bad actors always trying to make a dollar. I think it's going to become one of those key issues that we face in our locker rooms. I think it's more prevalent because there's more money involved. Everyone is trying to make a dollar. These young men are getting a lot of money. That is a lot right now, other than trying to hand out advice and provide some parameters to you. With this NIL situation, we've created our own problems in the college sport. So, it seems to be a fairly balanced, I think, view on all of it from Coach Drink at Mizzou. But I want to go ahead and let up. Triple option is king. Feel free to unmute when you get up here. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's going on.
What's going on? So I have a quick hypothetical question for you. It's a hypothetical scenario to run through. So You're a truck driver. You're driving down the highway. You see 4 people who want to hitchhike a ride. You can only give one of them a ride. It's 3 head coaches and 1 former college football player. It's Coach Drinkwitz, Lane Kiffin, Shane Beamer, and Craig James. Who are you giving a ride to, and why?
Can I? Well, I'm not going to try and run over any of them. That was my first thought, but I'm going to step back, and I'm not saying I'm going to aim the truck at any one of them. But I have had the opportunity to talk to Lane Kiffin a couple of times when he was really, I wouldn't say at the bottom, but when he had just started at FAU, like the preseason media days. And I kind of was like, I kind of think this guy. I didn't expect to like him as much. So I would enjoy hanging out with Lane Kiffin because I think he'd be a pretty fun guy to just like, if I'm stuck in a car and I have to have a conversation with somebody for a long period of time, I'm pretty sure he'd be interesting. Actually, to be fair, I've yet to talk to a head coach who wouldn't be interesting. I think the only difference is, and most of this the generation I'm about to talk about is no longer there. I mean, it's like maybe Nick Saban and a few others, but some of the older school head coaches, you'd be mostly just sitting and listening to them talk, and you wouldn't be kind of just happy to ask them a question that they would find interesting. But a lot of the other younger coaches, frankly, they'd just be fun guys to talk to. I mean, how do they get these young men to go play for them? It's like they got a personality. I mean, most of the guys are at the P5 level. You had to have been successful at the G5 level in some way, or as a head coach, or you were a good, coordinator of some sort. But how do you get young men to come play for you? You got to be interesting to a lot of them. And unless you can pull off the I'm the all-knowing dad thing, which is hard to do, especially I think Gen X and younger, it's not really in the wheelhouse of the skill set that a lot of folks were kind of, culturally growing up watching TV, watching whatever, you're not used to that being that personality at that age zone. So I think if I were to pick of that group, I would probably pick Lane Kiffin, but I can't imagine Drink would be any different. I think he'd be a fun guy just to talk to if we're just looking for who's going to be. And I love that question again. Thank you for that triple option. Just, who would be the person you would pick in that group? But Craig James, no, I wouldn't know. That I wouldn't want him in. I wouldn't even want to deal with him. I'd be like, oh, I pretend I wouldn't have even seen him. I'm like, hey, isn't that the guy with the women of the night? Or no, never mind. Oh, but I couldn't do that one. But thanks for that. That was actually a really great question. And actually, it's been about 30 minutes. There was so much to go over. I didn't even get through everything I wanted to talk about. I'm going to just bring up a couple of other quick news items. I'm not going to belabor them, but there was some really interesting stuff, as I said, in the off season. As we kind of steam ahead and get closer to the season, more stuff starts to come out. One of the funnier things I got announced, and funny is relative, I know, but Texas A&M, they have announced their Maroon Out game where everyone's going to wear maroon is against Mississippi State, which is a maroon team. So I'm not sure how much that's going to be intimidating to the opposing program when they are also a maroon team. But we got that one coming here. You know what? I see Quinshawn is him in the audience. He wants to come up and talk. I'd love to hear from you. I don't mind extending this a bit longer. You've been such a good listener for so many weeks. What's going on?
What's up?
Hey, what's going on? What's on your mind?
I've been looking at this stuff for a week, and I've been really wondering about what do you think of Missouri this year?
Oh my goodness. And of course, where's our Mizzou guy? He's not even on, he's been on break for a couple of weeks. Mizzou, the big question is, and we were just talking about Coach Drink a second ago, but the question is, can they keep improving on where they are? Can they get into that 7, 8, 9 win situation? I don't know. It's a tough schedule for them. We've kind of talked about it in previous weeks. I think, Coach Drink being at Mizzou, there's expectations are a little more tempered. He certainly was successful in his previous stop at App State, but Mizzou, it's tough. You're in the same division as Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina and Kentucky seem to be the teams you're jockeying for in position to try and claw your way to a decent finish within the division. But again, you have to be realistic. You got Georgia right there. So that's a huge problem in and of itself. So how far can they go? they've got some reasonable starting path. They've got actually an ideal kind of runway with their first two games. They've got an FCS tune-up with South Dakota, Middle Tennessee, which of course, Miami learned that they are not exactly a pushover last season, but they've got Middle Tennessee, and then they've got probably one of the most interesting early season games for two programs that want to prove themselves. One wants to prove that last year wasn't a fluke, and that's Kansas State, which again will probably go into that game with wins against Southeast Mizzou State and Troy. And both teams will probably go into that 2-0, and it'll be a moment to see which program is on the rise. And then beyond that, they got a couple of more winnable games. They're going to be playing Memphis and St. Louis. They are going to be playing at Vanderbilt. And then they've got, again, sort of a tough slog as they get into the heart of the SEC schedule with LSU coming in to Columbia. They got at Kentucky, South Carolina. Pulling out a bowl season there is doable, certainly. I think they've got at least 4 easy wins and then several games that should be dogfights. But going beyond that, it would take a little bit of luck. So Mizzou, that's going to be the challenge for them, and how much patience that program has for Coach Drink is, he's now, he's headed into year 4. So this is usually a point in time where you want to see more improvement. And again, it's been bowls every year, but they've been, not the greatest. And again, the win-loss record has not been stellar. So we'll see. That it's a good question, and Mizzou is certainly one of those that's going to be an interesting mystery for how they're going to turn out. And I know a lot of folks in that fan base are very curious to see. I mean, some of them were ready to throw him under the bus, Coach Drink under the bus last season, but he was able to keep them in it. And I think some folks were willing to he was able to get some of them back on his side, at least willing to give him a little more room to see where they're going to go. Before we close, another interesting story kind of tying in to the big kind of NIL stuff that happens in the offseason. BYU, there was an article, again, this is something that came out in the Salt Lake Tribune. BYU football players were starting to say that companies were underdelivering on promises to pay athletes through NIL. I'm sure this is not the only program and the only players to be seeing this, but again, we're only 2 years into NIL, and I'm wondering how many of these are really happening out there where players are getting promised things from local companies or booster organizations, collectives, and they're just simply not getting it. We've heard, of course, the Rashada debacle over at Florida, where they just couldn't deliver the money they had promised. But looking at this, this seems to be one of those tip of the iceberg kind of stories there. Another interesting story that came out early on, about a week ago, a little less than a week ago, Feinbaum said that Florida State is not nearly as attractive as they think they are regarding a move to the SEC. Again, I always like to look at what folks on our CFB like to say, and I got a real kick out of Arizona State fan temporary product 928's response. He put a translation that ESPN likes having FSU content at ACC prices and would really prefer not to pay the Noles the SEC price. So I think, and another fan pointed out, like if that conference broke up and suddenly the Big Ten were looking at Florida State, that Feinbaum would change his opinion quite quickly. And for University of Iowa fans, Gary Barta, the athletic director, is announced his retirement. So that seems to be pleasing quite a few of them. Now the question is, what comes next? Again, another joke off of our CFB. That means Kirk Ferentz is going to be there. Would that mean he'll be their athletic director and Brian Ferentz will be their new head coach? Well, that remains to be seen. On all of that, it has been now a little over 30 minutes. Generally, Tuesday nights in the off season, we keep this show to about 30 minutes. My name's Bob Ekhayeri. We'd like to hear your calls, although it's more me just kind of talking, and I appreciate you all joining me. This was our CFB Talk 141. Now I'm going to hang up and listen.